Great. Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Emily Lyons. I am the chair of the Democrats Abroad Global Asian American and Pacific Islander Caucus. This is the second event we are hosting in honor of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, which is the whole month of May. We kicked things off just this past Sunday with Congresswoman Grace Meng of New York, and there is a recording on our website, so just go check out our page if you want to see that. At the time of organizing this event, we obviously didn't think that we would be having this discussion following the leak of a draft opinion from the Supreme Court overturning the longstanding Roe versus Wade decision. Even though we may have assumed that this was a likely outcome based on the composition of the court, I, like many of you, were still very shocked and continue to be upset and angry about what this will mean for our entire society, but specifically for women. To try and see some silver lining in this week, we're glad that we have the opportunity to speak with Sung Yeon Choimorrow. She is the executive director of the National Asian and Pacific American Women's Forum. This forum is the only organization focused on building power with AAPI women and girls to influence critical decisions that affect our lives, our families, and our communities. They use a reproductive justice framework to elevate AAPI women and girls to impact policy and drive systemic change in the United States. They were established in 1996 to realize the vision of 100 AAPI women who recognized the need for an organization that would amplify AAPI women's stories and experiences. We have invited Sung Yeon to speak to us today about their work to fight for reproductive justice for AAPI women, their recently published State of Safety report, and why it's important for AAPI women to be heard. This organization is clearly aware of the importance of using one's voice to make change. Many of you are aware of the importance of using our voice by voting, and if you weren't sure about it, this week should have been a wake-up call. If you have yet to do so, make sure you request your ballot for the upcoming midterms. US citizens abroad must request a ballot once every calendar year, so make sure you do this today. If you haven't already, all you need to do is go to votefromabroad.org. If you would like to make a financial donation to Democrats Abroad to support our work to get out the vote, you can also do so via our website. We will put both of those links in the chat. Please remember that we'll be gathering questions for our speaker in the Zoom Q&A box. So you're welcome to type your question as we go along. We want to thank our guest, Sung Yeon Choimorrow, and all our attendees for joining us today, and we look forward to a stimulating conversation. I'll now hand it off to Sally Swartz, Chair of the Global Women's Caucus Reproductive Rights Task Force, and she will now introduce our speaker. Sally, take it away.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, today I have my hat on as the Global Women's Caucus chair, but I'm really the chair of the reproductive justice team within the Global Caucus. And I'm happy to be with you today to talk about what's going on in the reproductive justice world. But first, let me introduce Sung Yeon Choimorrow, a first-generation Korean-American working mother who is passionate about building power to create change so that her daughter can live in a more just world than the one she inherited. She leads the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, as Emily just stated, as their executive director, with the vision to build power with AAPI women and girls in the United States to create change so that we can have agency to make decisions about our bodies, our lives, our families, and our communities. The NAPAWF works to engage workers to get out and vote, as well as to continue to engage in advocacy on issues that impact AAPI women and girls, the most such as immigrant rights, reproductive health and rights, affordable health care, and economic justice. Before working at the NAPAWF, Sung Yeon Choimorrow was the director of organizing at Interfaith Worker Justice, leading collaborative work with community organizations, unions, and faith communities on worker organizing and worker justice public policy. Prior to working there, she was a community organizer at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago, where she created a Pan-Asian American Community Coalition in Chicago to work together on elections, immigration reform, the state budget, and redistricting, all very important issues to Asian American women. So now, having introduced her, I'm going to allow her to take it away and tell us all the great things she has to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for that introduction, and Emily for inviting me to be on this Zoom call with you all across the globe. This is so exciting. I consider myself a third culture kid. I grew up going to a boarding school in India as a Korean and then immigrated to the US. So I think I have a lot of affinity with folks who are expats and living abroad. So good to be in this space. Yeah, as Sally introduced, I'm a first generation Korean immigrant. My last name is the way it is because my partner and I decided we're gonna mush our names together. It just kind of worked out nicely. His name is Morrow and I'm Choi, and we mushed it together and it looks like it's supposed to be that way. I get asked about my last name a lot, so I just figured I would let people know. And yeah, I've been working at NAPAWF for 7 years now, and we're really focused on advancing public policy changes so that Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls living in the United States can have more equity and resources to live meaningful lives. And as Emily mentioned, we use the reproductive justice framework, which is a term that was coined by a group of Black women in the 90s as a way to expand on the framework of reproductive rights, right? That reproductive justice really means that it's not enough that, I mean, at this point, like protecting Roe seems like a huge mountain to climb, but that's really got to be the floor, that there's so many other barriers that we need to remove and, other issues that we need to work on in order for especially Black women and women of color to realize our full agency, right? Just having ability to choose whether to have a baby or not is not enough, that there are other factors that make our lives worthy and important. And so the definition that was coined then is, reproductive justice is ability to choose if, when, and how you want to parent, right? So it's all of the things. It's not just choosing if you want to have a child. It's about choosing if you want to or not, and when you want to, right? Because we also know that the United States has a history of forced sterilization on Japanese American women, Puerto Rican women, Black women. I mean, there's the other side of the coin of this issue as well. And then to be able to raise the children that we have in a way that's meaningful, right? And so that's where we come from. And that's why, I start with that definition because that's really at the crux of what NAPAWF is. We don't work on one issue. We're not a single issue organization because we believe that, when we are fighting to protect abortion access, we can't do that in a silo. We have to protect women's immigration status, regardless of if they're in an abusive situation. We have to be able to help immigrants reunite with their families. We got to work on a broken immigration system, and we've got to work on economic justice so that women can make meaningful decisions by having more resources to do so. And so those are the three: immigrant rights, economic justice, and reproductive rights and health are like the three areas that we focus on in our work. And the way we do it is by organizing in states that we believe in states where the AAPI population is growing rapidly, and we believe can be significant in elections down the road if AAPI is voted as a bloc and really were educated to vote. And so the place, like Georgia is a great example of where we're seeing some success with this. We invested in doing voter engagement work in Georgia 6 years ago. And, we were able to engage and get more AAPI voters out by doing outreach in multiple languages. And now we're investing in Florida and Texas as well. And the number one issue we work on when it comes to elections and getting people out to vote is helping people understand the ongoing changing rules around voting, right? Because all of these three states have passed new voter restrictions. And so our team is really, on top of calling all of our voters back to make sure they understand the changes, that they, because all these changes are not available in languages that our communities speak. And so we take on the task of making sure that our communities understand the changes and that they're able to, still have access to the ballot. And so that's a big part of what we do. I know Emily referred to our safety report earlier in the introduction. We did do a national polling of AAPI women earlier this year. And I mean, obviously many of you will remember last year's really tragic event of the Atlanta spa shooting, and that kind of spurred in the United States attention on Asian Americans and Asian American Pacific Islander community issues in a way that it hadn't before. And in an effort for us to continue to increase visibility around conversations about our community, we did the safety report to talk about, thank you, Emily, I was gonna say, I can put the link in, talk about where the state of safety is for Asian American Pacific Islander women now. And I just wanna highlight like top 3 things. One is we oversampled in the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community because they're always underrepresented in data because of the size of the population. So we made sure that we were able to collect enough data from an HPI community so that they were statistically significant. We divided up our survey into subgroups. So East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. And the number one thing that stuck out to me was that when you look at the survey and people answering the question, have you experienced any harassment or violence, racialized violence in the last 12 months, 78% of the people answered that they have, and there is no statistical difference between the subgroups of ethnicities. Based on the news, you would think that it was mostly East Asian women who would say that, we're experiencing the most violence and harassment, but our data set showed that it is across the board. All Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women are experiencing harassment. And over 70% of those who said that they had experienced this said they experienced it in public places by people they didn't know, right? So this is a huge public safety crisis for our AAPI community. And lastly, the statistic I want to highlight is that over 80% of the respondents said that they have, they live with fear and anxiety over their personal safety right now, right? I mean, that's a lot. That's 8 out of 10 people we surveyed across the country saying that they're, they are distressed because of what's going on. And then lastly, we did ask, did they feel like elected officials were doing enough to, to be responsive? And the answer was, it was interesting. So 32% said yes. Then there was like 40-some% that said no, but there was also a high percentage of people who said they didn't know, which I found so interesting. And so I think that that's an indication of our community members still not being really tuned in and engaged civically to understand what it means to know whether your elected official is doing things that are in your community's interest and benefit, right? So I think there's opportunity there for us to reach out and educate voters on what is being done, what more needs to be done, and how do we do accountability. And of course, yes, 3 days ago was Asian American Pacific Islander Equal Pay Day. So, when we talk about, Equal Pay Day, I'll just give you the definition first. So Equal Pay Day is the day, it's how many more months and days it takes for a woman to make what a white man made in the previous calendar year, right? So for Asian American Pacific Islander women, it took us 4 months and 3 days to make, in addition, to make what a white man made just in last calendar year, right? So we needed to work this additional four months and three days. And which means that Asian American Pacific Islander women are making 75 cents to a white man's dollar. And, I think it's really important for us to highlight the economic gaps in our community too, because I think, I don't know if many of you are aware and, maybe not as attuned to it because, living abroad, but in the United States, there is this stereotype and, acceptance by largely by our mainstream society that Asian Americans are seen as the model minority, right? That we are all high achieving and went to Ivy League schools, make six-figure salaries, and we're all living the life. And, we're not, we're all doing fine. And so I think when you look at the wage gap data, it shows you that that's not true. And if you disaggregate the data even further, that's where the real story is at, right? Nepalese American women make 44 cents to a white man's dollar. So they're making like 30 cents less than what even the AAPI average shows. And so again, that goes to show the wide range and diversity within our community that gets invisibilized when we aggregate the data. And so, at NAPAWF, we're really committed to telling the full story because there are only four racial ethnic groups that make 75 cents or more that data accurately reflects our community. And all the other ethnic groups make less than 75 cents to a white man's dollar. So you can see how even the data that's out there about our community is a bit skewed and not necessarily telling the full story. And of course, why does that matter? I mean, I think economic justice, ability for a woman to earn a living and make decisions to be in the workforce and have family, those all go to our core tenet of creating a world where women have agency to make decisions about ourselves. And so I think that's a really important component of it. And and in fact, I was talking about how, it related to even ability to have abortion access now, given the SCOTUS leak, right? That the people that are going to be most impacted by this decision are poor women living in red states. That's bottom line, what it comes down to, right? That they're going to have to travel out of state. And if they don't have money to pay for a plane ticket, they're driving. And if they can't afford to take time off to drive out of state, like it becomes an economic issue, right? And this is why fighting for closing the wage gap, increasing minimum wages, making sure people can make livable wages, these will all contribute to a woman's ability to make decisions about our bodies and access abortion care, and it'll be even more critical as once this decision actually comes down and we see some of these states banning abortion. So I just wanted to say that when it comes to reproductive rights and issue of accessing abortion and AAPI women, I think it's really important to understand a few things. One, I think most people don't know what Asian American Pacific Islanders think about the issue of abortion access, or they think we're all apolitical or we're all quote unquote Christians and therefore we must be, anti-choice, quote unquote pro-life, right? And so I just wanted to share a little bit about like where AAPI women are on this issue, and then talk a little bit about what it might mean for AAPI women, if we, when, I guess at this point, when we come to a place where we are living in a post-war reality. Over close to 60% of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, support abortion access. It's actually one of the higher, national average is like 48% or 52%. We're much higher than that. And this information is all on our web. It'll go live today, actually, because we have a petition that we encourage all of you to sign on abortion justice. And it also has some talking points about how it impacts AAPI communities. There's a Pew Research there. But if you just take AAPI women, over 78% of AAPI women support a woman's right to choose, right? So again, I mean, it's overwhelmingly, almost 8 out of 10 of us say, yes, we should have access to abortion services, right? And in terms of impact of, and like who is having abortion, right? AAPI women's pregnancies, and a third of AAPI women's pregnancies end in abortion compared to the national average, which is 18%. So as you can see, you know, this will disproportionately impact AAPI women. It is already very difficult for AAPI women to access abortion because of language and cultural barriers. And obviously with the SCOTUS decision, it's gonna make it even more challenging. What I am most concerned about going into reality in post-Roe is more related to perceptions of Asian American Pacific Islander women and our, what quote unquote, our community practices. So over the last 2 decades, the religious right Republicans have been introducing these bills in state called sex-selective abortion bans. And they use the rationale that, you know, Koreans, Chinese, Indians, Asians in general have the sun preference and have high rates of sex-selective abortions. And therefore we have to pass these laws to protect girl babies, right? Like they made this thing up and basically decided this was gonna be a rationale as to one more way to try and limit a woman's ability to have abortion access. Well, NAPAWF did a national research on it, and the data actually shows that that's not true. That in fact, Korean American, Indian American women are having more girl babies than their white counterparts in the United States, right? So again, they're using racist stereotypes to pass bills that are in their favor. And what this does is that it essentially demonizes Asian American Pacific Islander women, because these bills are passing in states like Arkansas and Arizona and Mississippi, Missouri, where there are not that many Asian Americans to begin with. And so if you turn on the TV and the first thing you hear about AAPI women is this, you're going to think that that's your image of Asian Americans. And so that can lead to criminalization of Asian American Pacific Islander women for their pregnancy outcome. And we saw this in 2 really high profile cases in Indiana, where this particular law had passed. And then 2 years later, a woman was criminalized for attempting suicide. She survived, but the fetus didn't, and they charged her with murder, right? And then literally the day that they dropped her charges and she was free, 3 years later, another Indian American woman living in South Bend was charged because she went into the hospital because of excess bleeding from a miscarriage, and they, instead of treating her, called the police and they charged her with infanticide, right? So these are things that happen to AAPI women because of assumptions that are made about why we have abortions. And I'm concerned that this will only become more prevalent as we move into post-Roe, and you know, you have these states that are, you know, enacting laws that are really dangerous and continue to demonize women of color and why we make our choices. So I'll stop there and leave us ample time for Q&A. So I'll turn it back over to you, Emily.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate what you had to say, and I'm sure people have lots of questions, but we do, before we get started on that, we had a couple ourselves. So Sally, why don't you start us off with the first question?
Okay, no problem. Thank you so much for sharing all that information and knowledge with us. It was really very interesting for me, who is not all that familiar with what your organization does. And it sounds fascinating, but what I'd like to do right now is address the elephant in the room, which is the decision that was leaked by SCOTUS that will effectively overrule Roe versus Wade. I actually have read it, and what it does is it has decided to annihilate the right of privacy, which was created by a number of lawsuits before SCOTUS. And this one in Roe, they created the right of privacy within the 14th and the 9th Amendment. So my question to you is, what are we going to do about this? Because obviously it affects much more grievously minority women and poor women who are often minority women, if not always. And the reproductive action team that I had are doing a few things, but we're not doing anything particularly just focused on Asian American women. We're doing it for all women. Schumer, we were talking about this in the green room. Schumer said he was bringing back the Women's Protective Health Act to the floor of the Senate for a vote. You seemed a bit negative about the chances of that going through. Just for those who are listening, that if it were ever voted, that act would protect pregnancy, abortion, essentially through the first trimester and in other circumstances as well. So what's your best activism? You're an activist and you run a great organization. I'm a lawyer and run a great organization, but how can we meet and make this happen? What are your suggestions? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, I'm an organizer through and through, and you're right. We have this vote coming up on the Women's Health Protection Act, which if it passed would be amazing. But the reality is we just don't have the numbers. It always comes back down to the fact that we just don't have the numbers. And so I think that it's really critical that anybody who cares about any kind of human rights, civil rights, progress, make sure this country is not going backwards, really needs to be invested in voter engagement. I mean, I think that, I believe that it is really time to not completely divest, but like really pivot to supporting and resourcing states versus kind of thinking about what we can do at the federal level. I think that we need the building blocks in place in order for us to have any meaningful impact at the federal level. And so, to me, that's really where it's at, is this midterm elections. I mean, the analysis is already that, that the Dems may most likely lose the House, right? Like, it's already not great. And I think this, in some ways, this ruling, if we are diligent and do our work well, we can really carry the momentum and get people out to vote in November and tell a different story. That's my hope, is that we're able to get people out and help them understand how they need to. I mean, we can't tell them how to vote, but help them make the correlation between the different candidates and the issues they cover and make a judgment call for themselves, right? So that's really important work that we need to invest in. And so I think for those of you who are abroad, if you are from one of these critical states, make sure you request that ballot, like Emily said. Some of these elections are really coming down to, few votes, literally. So it's really critical. And I think important, just as important, is talking to your family. One of the things that we found about Asian American Pacific Islander community is that people are more likely to listen to people they trust already than some stranger calling them about election, right? And so in fact, our voter engagement model is more like it's more like a phone tree than like random calls, because we look for community leaders who then can influence other people, right? So that's really what I think we can do. I think as much as we can, we need to be vocal. I know the reality is, I think there are more Americans who support abortion access, but they're what we call silent, sidewalk supporters, right? They're not actively supporting us. They're on the sidelines, right? We need more people on the sidelines to make more noise. And I'm really glad to see so many people coming out of like literally people that I had no idea in my Facebook, feed. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Like we need more people to come out and speak up so that, it's amply clear that there are more of us who are in support of protecting Roe than not.
I have an add-on to the question. Is your organization supporting the march or the protests that are going to take place on March 14th, May 14th?
May 14th?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of our members are, part of, some of our organizers are part of states that are, part of the planning committee. We there was a big rally already in New York where our members spoke at, and so we'll be involved here and there. Yeah.
Good to know.
Great. One of the questions I wanted to ask that also ties into this, making sure that the AAPI community is voting, is, are there specific issues that you're finding help motivate people in the community to get out to vote? Do they have, their specific hot button issues that you try to tap into, that you see as a good way to get people to turn out to the polls?
Yeah. So, what's so interesting to me is, especially first-time voters, many of them, they're citizens and they didn't realize they could vote. Because, that's how deeply ingrained this idea of the stereotype of the perpetual foreigner is, right? So many Asian immigrants don't realize that when you become a citizen, you have all the rights as everybody else, like the white people, right? As my parents talk about, right? They still refer to them as the Americans and we're Korean, right? I'm like, no, we're Americans too, right? And so I think that's been a really interesting, eye-opening thing for me, is it's not even about specific issues per se, but it's people don't feel like they deserve to vote. They don't feel like they're entitled to vote. And so we do a lot of education around that this is your right. You contribute to this country, you are a member of the society, and it is your right that this is your right and responsibility, right? To shape the country so that it reflects more of who we are and our values as well, right? And that seems to work for folks, especially first-time voters. Obviously, this last election, the pandemic, the COVID-19 was top of mind for most people and why they came out to vote. I would say healthcare is also, affordable healthcare is also a really big motivator. And so when we did polling of AAPI women voters who voted in the 2020 elections, and the top reasons why they came out to vote, one was affordable healthcare and protecting Affordable Care Act. Two was clean water, actually, access to clean water. I know, it's so interesting. And then thirdly was immigration related, just wanting different immigration laws. And so those are the things that motivate Asian Americans to come out and vote. And yeah, I think, but interestingly, it's also we always sort of think that people need this issue to come out and vote. And what we discovered is that people don't even know that they can vote. So that's something we've been working on.
That's really interesting. Also a great reminder, I think we notice that too, being overseas, there's a lot of people that don't realize that they live overseas and they can still vote. So we also do a lot of dispelling of that myth that they can vote and they also don't have to pay, which someone did ask me once. Sally, you had a second question. Why don't you go ahead and ask that before we turn to the Q&A?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Emily. You mentioned earlier in your presentation about AAPI women voting as a bloc, which I found really interesting. So I wanted to ask you about that. And my question is, do you really think that AAPI women would vote as a bloc? Because we're learning more and more, at least in Democrats generally, that these interest groups, whatever they may be, for example, Hispanics or people that consider themselves of the Jewish religion, they don't vote as a bloc. So I was wondering how you saw that, and if you think that's an exception to what we're finding is a general misconception about how people vote. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. What you're saying about the other groups, that's really interesting. It is true that I would say that I'm not quite sure that I would describe it as a voting block yet, but I definitely know when we've done these post-election surveys that Asian American women rank very highly on similar issues, right? Like over 80% said they want to preserve ACA. Over 70%, 75% say they want to reform immigration laws. Like, so there's definitely that. And I mean, when you disaggregate by ethnicity, there's some variance, right? So that's the other thing, the other component, right, of Asian Americans that we're not a monolith, right? The AAPI community is not a monolith, but I do think generally we are trending much more. We're trending much more towards the progressive side, caring about issues of quality of education, affordable healthcare, things that, I think kind of unify us together as a group. Obviously there are some, I would say Asian American women vote differently than Asian American men, that's for sure.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So that's why I keep saying Asian American Pacific Islander women as a voting bloc. I would not say that AAPI community as a whole is a voting bloc. No, like you can definitely see the variance. So like the fact that, 58% of Asian Americans support abortion access, but when you only poll women, that number jumps up to 80%, okay. Right? Yeah. So you can see that there's differences. And every time there is, I think Asian American AAPI vote or Asian American decisions, they do these post-election pollings and they provide data by ethnicity, not everybody, but like the top ethnicities and then top populous ethnicities, and then by gender, you can definitely see the breakdown, right? And that's why we're committed to turning out AAPI women voters, because when they do vote, they tend to vote, more in alignment with the policy issues that we care about. And they're the ones who tend to be most, what's the word? Like, they're the ones who are like, oh, I didn't know I could vote, most likely to feel that way. Some families, they're like, oh, I thought only my husband could vote, right? Like, wow. Literally, like, yeah. That, oh yeah, my husband votes, but I don't vote. Like, I don't think I can vote. And so we actually, one of our most effective tool that we have is our canvassers are led by a team of aunties. These are like middle-aged immigrant generation women who mostly their predominant language is their native language. And they're the ones who lead the door-to-door and canvassing. And then we can get to the other aunties, right? Because it's not some, random young college volunteer showing up at your door, like talking to you in English. It's your community member who's speaking your language saying, hey, look, I can do this, you can do this. We can do this together, right? And so that's where we found to be most effective.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
That's really something. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so one of the first questions we got from one of our attendees, what do you think are the most important issues that mainstream white feminism is missing in the discussion of reproductive justice for AAPI women?
That's a really great question. I think generally there is a sense of, how would I say this? Like in a moment, like in a crisis moment, like when we're about to lose Roe. I mean, this is a pretty devastating, horrific moment we're in. People tend to then jump to like, let's focus on this singular issue and worry about the other things later on, right? And that's how women of color always get kind of put to the margin. And intersectional issues don't get discussed because that's problematic, or not everybody's going to be on board if we include this and that. And so what I find happening, is we want to talk about women first and then women of color next. And rather than saying we have to talk about women of color first because this disproportionately impacts women of color, right? So that's a very simplistic way to put it, but I do think that has huge impact on who leads and what kind of solutions we end up with, because you don't have the most impacted people at the center of the decision, right? So, you know, we would love to see Roe codified through the Women's Health Protection Act, but many women of color organizations like NAPAWF has always said, even with Roe still being the law of the land right now, right? Many women of color, for them, Roe is not a reality. They still cannot access abortion. So if you just put that floor as the ceiling in WIPA, then you're still leaving women of color out, right? And so I think, to me, this sense of like, let's keep it simple so we can get this done at the expense of at the expense of it's still leaving women of color out is a huge problem for me and a concern for many reproductive justice leaders. And I do think that we need to come to a place where we can talk about and think about how do we, like, there is this sense of urgency of now that I believe is being used to exclude people, which I don't think makes any sense, especially given like the makeup of the Senate, like this is not gonna pass, right? And so if it's not gonna pass, why are we so set on pushing something through that still excludes so many people, right? And so I think, to me, feminism needs to be intersectional, and mainstream feminism right now is not.
Thank you. The next question we want to ask is, looking at some of these states that maybe we'll be able to flip or hopefully be successful in November, are there any large AAPI communities in those states that can help us win in November? And are there voter registration organizations working on the ground to get out this community, such as yourselves, that you can mention?
Yeah. So, you know, we're a C3 organization, so I've got to really watch how I phrase things. But so, you know, so I can talk a little bit about where we're invested in, and then talk about some other organizations that are really invested. I do think that there is there are some tremendous opportunities in the South with AAPI population, because we are really growing in, you know, the fastest AAPI, the states that have the fastest growth rate of AAPI population are Texas, Georgia, Florida, right? Like it's not the North or the Midwest anymore, you know, like we all think about California and New York. In fact, they're like losing AAPI population, even though there's still more of us there, right? So I think there are opportunities in places like Texas. Obviously, Texas is not flipping anytime soon. You know, we're hopeful that, you know, I mean, I think you know, holding on to Georgia, you know, Florida is an interesting state to watch for. But, you know, I think that Asian Americans haven't, we haven't galvanized in like the numbers yet to really make that dent. And I think that's coming. So like Georgia was one of those instances where it did happen, right? Like we've been investing in Georgia for 6 years now, or 8 years actually, over the 2 presidential elections. And, you know, I think AAPI community voter turnout made a difference in that election, right? Like that's our hope, that we're going to get there with some of these other states. I just don't see that happening in the 2022 election.
Thank you. The next question we had, do you know of state or local organizations providing direct support to AAPI women in getting access to reproductive health care?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, we're an advocacy organization, but sometimes our members, you know, find us because really we're one of the only AAPI organizations that talk about abortion publicly. To be honest, it's kind of sad, but we're changing that. We're trying to get more friends on board. So there aren't organizations specific to AAPI communities that provide services, but what we see is there are a lot of organizations that support survivors of domestic violence tend to see folks who are seeking abortion services. So then we connect them to organizations like the various abortion funds that are available can provide. So we sort of play the connector versus, there isn't a specific service organization that just provide for AAPI women, but we're able to make the connection so that they have somebody from their own cultural background who speak their language that can support them, and that's usually a staff member from the DV organization. And then, they're able to coordinate with the abortion fund or some sort of social service for them to have access. So that's how that's been working.
That's great. Kind of turning back to the voting among the AAPI women, do you see a difference in voting issues between AAPI women who are first-generation Americans and their mothers who immigrated? And what can we do as younger AAPI voters to help reach out to the older generation?
Yeah, there is. I mean, that's a really good question. I would encourage folks who are really interested in this to go to, I think it's called Asian American Decisions website, and look at their polling data from the 2 presidential elections, because it does give that breakdown. I would say that younger American-born women tend to be much more on the quote unquote progressive end. But surprisingly, our immigrant generation folks are too. That it's not that they're not, it's just that we, I think don't quote me on this, but I think on the question of right to abortion access, it was something like, it's not super accurate because we did it by age versus immigrant generation, but we made some assumptions. Like people who we surveyed between ages of 18 and 30 said, it was like 97% of them said they support abortion access. And then that drops with the age bracket, right? So again, overall, there's 78% of us still support abortion access. So the margins aren't huge, but like it's still there. I think what we can do as younger folks is really helping. So, what I realized about my parents, when I don't talk to them about these issues, they're getting their information from somewhere because they watch. Unfortunately, I was appalled to find out my parents watch fake news. They watch news on YouTube, and I was like, who do you watch on YouTube? Right? And then I was like, we have to get cable because I want them watching like the Korean Broadcast Corporation, like the legitimate news, because they're finding stuff online that, and then they'll come out and say some random things like, oh, I heard on the news today, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what news, right? And so I think it's really important for us. And I know many of our parents are like on WhatsApp and all these that are just notorious for misinformation. So I think it's really important for us to engage in conversations with our parents so that if your parents are hold very different values and views altogether, that's, I can understand why you wouldn't want to talk about it, but I do think if, they're really being misguided, there are some opportunities for us to say, actually, that's not what, CNN said or whatever. That's kind of what I do with my parents. So I think that's important. I think that, talking to especially the aunties and your grandma and your mom, talk to the women, they're a lot more badass than they come across, because often in these family settings, it's the men that talk, and they talk a lot, and they don't necessarily say things that align with us. Talk to the women. And I think it's important for us to encourage our elders, especially the women in our family, so that they have the confidence to be like, oh, I can go out and vote. It's not just my husband. I can have, I can vote the way I want to. And, to be able to build that kind of meaningful relationship with your family members can make a huge difference.
I think that's a perfect thing that you mentioned with the misinformation that you're dealing with, that your parents are looking at this fake news on YouTube, but maybe tying into this a bit, are there things that your organizers are noticing about this issue with misinformation that's growing among the AAPI community? And how are you trying to combat that as an organization?
So I have to tell you a funny story, because I am laughing because many of our staff members' moms are on WhatsApp. And because they have children that work at NAPAWF, they like go and have these fights on WhatsApp with these people saying like, that's not true. That's not what my daughter told me. And, you know, they did this research and, you know, so I laugh because we have these ambassadors out there now who are doing their bit to dispel the misinformation. I mean, we do see it, I mean, especially in the, you know, the Chinese speaking community. The Koreans aren't as much on WhatsApp, but they still get misinformation from other places. I know Indian Americans are also on WhatsApp a lot, and that's happening. So we've tried to think of, you know, some of us were like, well, maybe we should get on WhatsApp and you know, so I know that a couple of people that are on there just to track what's there, just so we know what the misinformation is, because I think often the biggest mistake we make in the progressive movement is we don't pay attention to what the religious right or, you know, the right-wing people are doing. Like, we need to pay attention because they, like I said earlier, you know, if you're not talking to your parents about it, if you're not talking to people about it, they are, right? And so we need to understand where people are coming with their information so that when we talk, we know how to relate to people, right? That we know what we're trying to dispel, because I think, you know, we can't just claim that like, well, our values are obviously right. Like, we work from a human rights framework, so of course people should believe us. Like, yeah, that's true, but that's not the reality. And so I think being educated, being in the know is really important. And we do see that happening. And so, you know, we try to meet people where they are and really talk about, okay, well, that's what they say, but like, what's your lived experience? Like, we really try to go back to that, because fundamentally, the misinformation does not match people's reality often. And we're not interested in like, we're not going for like the people that are like deep in it and they're never going to recover. We're trying to prevent more people from going that direction, or who are like sort of, you know, reading it at face value, right? We're really trying to go for sort of the middle people who could easily fall into the deep depths of misinformation and kind of get swallowed up in that, and trying to prevent that. And so it's not a lot of people, you know, it's not a whole lot of people. And if there are people who are committed to misinformation and that's their life, like, we're not interested in those folks. We're like, thank you, have a nice day, bye, right? But we are interested in the middle block who are looking for information, who are interested in and are being misguided.
Well, thank you for that. Just want to be respectful of your time. So the last thing I want to ask is, you know, where do we go from here? Where are you going from here? What are the next steps? And what is it that we can do moving forward as we kind of, I guess, in this in between where we probably know what's coming, but it's not quite official.
It's, what do we, I mean, I'm gonna sound like the crazy lady who keeps saying the same thing, but you know, I really think that this is the moment where we need to pivot and be disciplined about the long game, right? I know everybody wants a quick fix. Well, I'm sorry, we're out of options. We really literally don't have a quick fix, right? There are some things I think that the president can do in terms of executive order that could, you know, provide some relief immediately, but like, there just really isn't. And so I think it's really important for us to like take a deep breath, buckle down, and know that this is going to be a long game, right? And know that there is a pathway to victory. Like, this isn't over, right? But we're not going to win tomorrow, is what I'm trying to say. I think we have this, like, we've kind of, you know, in the era of like social media, Twitter and microwave, like, we want everything so quickly, like, that's not going to happen. And so you can't lose interest or hope and say, oh, well, it's not working. Well, we're not getting what we want. So I'm not going to do this anymore, right? Like, we need to know this is a marathon. We need to buckle down, and we need to really, like, step by step, methodologically engage people in our community about how we're going to make the changes that we need to see. So I think that's really, I know it sounds so boring, but that really is the next step. And I'm really hopeful, you know, the reality is that the face of America is changing, right? That there's not going to be a majority race in this country in like the next decade or two, right? Like, it's not that far. And so for us, it's about holding, and you know, what I say is white supremacy is fighting back because they're going to lose, right? And so this is only going to get worse before it gets better. And so we need to really like buckle down, take a deep breath, and like be in it for the long haul, because what they are hoping is that as they roar back and fight like hell to preserve white supremacy, they're hoping that enough of us will then lose interest or cave and go away so that they can remain, right? And so we need to like really understand, I don't know, I'm starting to sound like Hunger Games or something, but like, you know, we really need to understand this is a long game, and it's really a fight for generations to come, right? Like it's not going to be over even in our lifetime, but we need to commit to it, because then the next generation has something to build on, right? We can't, you know, we have to hold our line, even if it feels like we're not winning right now. And so I don't know, I hope that was a bit of a pep talk and encouragement for everybody in this really dire moment. That's at least what I tell myself every day, going to bed and when I wake up, because yeah, I mean, it's just, we knew it was going to happen, but as it hits, like, I feel like we're living in some sort of alternate reality. You know, I can't believe this is happening literally 2 weeks after Mexico's Supreme Court they made the opposite decision. Like, I can't believe this. Yeah, I can't wrap my head around it.
Well, thank you for that. I know I needed the pep talk, so I really appreciated it. And I thank you so much for spending your valuable time in a very busy schedule with us today. So thank you so much for this. I also want to thank Sally from the Global Women's Caucus for co-hosting with me today. And I want to thank everyone that joined the call. Please remember, we do have more events lined up to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month. This includes an event on May 19th with Grace Shimizu and Brian Nia on remembering the legacy of Japanese American incarceration. And we also have an event on May 28th with Diego Sanchez from PFLAG, which will be our transition into Pride Month in June. You can find more information about these events on our website, which I put the link in the chat. Please check it out, RSVP, we'd love to see you again. I'd also like to thank, before we close, Karen Frankenstein, who helped with the tech for our event. If you would like to get involved at all with Democrats Abroad, we would all love to have you. Just send us an email at aapi@democratsabroad.org and let us know how you want to get involved. You can also, as I mentioned earlier, make a financial donation on our website to continue, so that we can continue to have events like this, and also make sure we get out the vote for November. And last but not least, I can't say it enough, make sure you request your ballot. All you need to do is go to votefromabroad.org. It doesn't take long, and it will make a huge impact in November. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Sung Yeon, for being here. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Karen. And we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.